Hello, I'm Graham Elwood. Welcome to another episode of Church of the Batman. We're going to go over an article today that came out in the Atlantic about a new proposal by the Center for Disease Control about a new rule that would expand its powers. Could be misused. On August 15th, with little fanfare, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, the CDC, took steps to improve its ability to deal with infectious outbreaks. The agency proposed a new rule that would expand its powers to screen, test, and quarantine people traveling into or within the United States in the event of a crisis like the historic Ebola outbreak of 2014. Sounds like a good thing, right? Right? The threat of infectious diseases is omnipresent and growing. Familiar threats like flu, Ebola, or measles continually rear their heads, often in new guises, while completely new dangers like MERS or SARS can take the world by surprise. When that happens, the CDC must act quickly and decisively, and its new powers will purportedly help to do it so. But some epidemiologists, lawyers, and health organizations say that the rule, in its current form, poses a serious threat to civil liberties, allowing authorities to detain and examine people with little heed to due process and informed consent. Liberals with all of their civil liberties complaining again. They're giving themselves the benefit of the doubt, says Jennifer Nuzzo, an epidemiologist at the UPMC Center for Health Security and a co-author of a recent paper criticizing the proposed rule. I don't worry about the CDC, she says. I worry about people above them making them do things they don't want to do because they've given themselves these broad powers. Those powers will make their jobs easier until they don't. So the CDC tried a similar thing like this in 2005, they proposed a rule that would have expanded their quarantine powers and require airlines to maintain a traveler database. The travel industry, among many other people, there was a wave of people criticizing it, so they shelved the rule. But this new incarnation is similar and perhaps even broader in scope. It covers public health emergencies, which are defined as any communicable disease event and that the director thinks could spread or is highly likely to cause death or serious illness if not properly controlled. So I don't want to just be like, this is a tricky thing, because if there is an epidemic or a pandemic that breaks out, it's very dangerous, and how organizations react is critical. I did an earlier video about if something like this breaks out, how is Trump going to react with his lock everything down, and it doesn't always. There's examples of when it's handled correctly and how many agencies in different countries are involved to make it handled correctly. And if you mishandle that on a governmental level, it can make the problem worse. Here's the thing that's interesting. The director of the CDC can be changed by the president at any time without Senate confirmation. Trump won't abuse that. During such events, the CDC could screen people at airports and other transport hubs, apprehend those they suspected being ill for 3 days, and potentially quarantine or isolate them pending a medical review. It is already authorized to detain people suspected of carrying diseases like plague, Ebola, and somewhat probably smallpox. But the new rule does away with a formal list. It extends the same powers to any quarantainable communicable disease and uses wider range of symptoms from a list that federal agents can update as need arises for defining ill people. So there's good reasons behind these expansions, right? The current system was created in 1944, and it needs an update, because in 1944 there wasn't jet travel where someone can get on a plane and 10-12 hours later be on a completely different continent, and so something can spread pretty easily. For example, the existing list of warning symptoms doesn't cover many important signs of known diseases like Ebola or MERS. Meanwhile, new and unknown illnesses are emerging all the time. The CDC, trying to equip itself with sufficiently flexibility to respond to diseases we've never heard of in a way where it doesn't have to revisit these rules every few years, says James Hodge Jr., professor of public health law and ethics at Arizona State University. I'm supportive of that. So as am I. But Hodge, Nuzzo, and others feel that the CDC risks sacrificing personal liberty at the altar of flexibility and expediency. Quote, the rule allows the CDC to move on somebody based on some belief that they might pose some amorphous risk to others, says Hodge. That's not a standard that survives constitutional scrutiny. Yeah, and again, this could be, someone could really put this in the wrong hands. This could be really misused. Let's say there's, all it would take is some sort of Muslim disease that was started, and then, we're going to quarantine Muslims. Trump is already talking about this Muslim registry, which is ridiculous. For starters, the rule is very sparse when it comes to due process. It allows the CDC to detain travelers indefinitely before deciding whether to quarantine them, saying only the agency doesn't expect such apprehensions to last for more than 72 hours. So I can detain you for as long as I want. I just don't expect it's going to be very long. You're all good with that, right? Anyone out there that travels? It also doesn't make legal provisions. It doesn't make provisions for legal counsel if someone can't afford a lawyer themselves. So we can just detain you or quarantine you for an unlimited amount of time, and if you don't have the money for a lawyer, we're not going to provide you with one. How could that be misused? And it puts any reviews of the agency's decisions under the auspices of its own employees rather than a neutral third party. Man, that is a problem. Using the rule, a future administration could hold travelers in government custody for days or weeks without providing an explanation or an opportunity for the individuals to challenge their detentions. Wrote Emma Roth and Kyle Edwards from the Yale Law School. Oh, it's Yale Law. Sounds like a bunch of East Coast liberal elitists. The rule also gives the CDC ultimate authority to carry out medical tests and treatments, stating that the individual's consent shall not be considered as a prerequisite to the exercise of any authority. That's medically unethical, says Hodge, since informed consent has been a bedrock of medicine for decades. If you don't get it, you could have additional quarantine, but you don't get to force informed consent on people. This is the thing, like, we don't want to, if some super bug or super virus starts sweeping around the country, or the world that matter, it could be devastating. But this just quarantine anybody? I feel that's scary. And I'm not just saying completely shut this down, because the CDC needs to have some flexibility in its power, but this gets tricky. The rule needs to be sort of, there needs to be some amendments to it. So there are basically due process steps that could be put in place that would not undermine the CDC's powers, but that would put in checks and balances so that when the powers are exercised, it's done in a way that respects civil liberties. We might have to cut here. Mm-hmm. Oh. Okay. I've been talking too much. All right. The stickier problem is that there's little evidence to support screening or quarantining travelers. Okay, this is interesting. Consider the Ebola outbreak. The CDC screened more than 38,000 travelers flying into the U.S. by interviewing them and checking their medical records. Then they monitored over 10,000 people for 21 days, and they caught exactly 0 cases of Ebola. So what? Why take the chance? Why not ensure that we'll catch the rare exceptions in the future? Here's the thing. It bears emphasizing. What you think would work in an outbreak often does not work. In these situations, so-called common sense can completely backfire. Nuzzo talks about why screening doesn't work. With Ebola, you're not transmissible until you're really sick, and then you're not moving, right? So you can't even, it's hard to screen it. It's telling that Thomas Duncan, a Liberian man who was diagnosed with Ebola while visiting family in Dallas, didn't spread the virus to anyone in his family or his community. He only transmitted it to 2 nurses who were caring for him long after it was obvious that he had Ebola. Quarantiners could have serious unintended consequences. You create the expectation that you keep cases out by monitoring them, and there's no evidence that we can do this, says Nuzzo. If the disease does enter the country, that would seriously damage the credibility of health workers, the CDC included. When Dr. Craig Spencer fell sick with Ebola in New York after having helped with the outbreak in Guinea, he was vilified. People went on a witch hunt to find all the places he'd been to or eaten at, even though there was no risk of him spreading the virus at any of those places. See how dangerous this can be? And that's why a law like this, and what happens, and I talked about it in the pandemic video, hysteria, fear starts popping up. So if you don't have the correct laws in place, or you don't have enough, like there's no due process and you can just quarantine and lock people up, and everyone just gets paranoid. Oh, everywhere this doctor went, if he touched anything, don't touch it. Everyone just freaks out and they don't have the correct information. And if you start monitoring people, then you're enforcing that message. That's what is said here. The distrust and confusion will be exacerbated if people fear they will be quarantined unfairly. Right? If you're worried that they're just going to come lock you up and like, oh, I just had a cough, and they're like, oh, you're sick, then you're going to go, you might hide. And if you are actually infected, you might go underground versus getting the help that you need because you don't want to be locked up in some crazy quarantine detention camp. So, and if the health workers share those fears, they will be unwilling to travel to outbreak zones to help. That happened in the last Ebola outbreak. Thanks to the CDC's quarantines, the number of American health workers traveling to West Africa fell by 25%. Many worried they would lose their jobs if they were isolated for weeks upon their return. It's tricky, guys. Simple solutions don't work. Quarantine also creates severe stigma. In 2014, 2 public health workers and a family of 6 Liberian immigrants were quarantined in Connecticut. Though none had been exposed to Ebola or posed any threat to public health, the state confined these individuals to their homes for weeks, wrote Roth and Edwards, who represented him. The state failed to provide these individuals with food or basic necessities and failed to inform some that they had the legal right to challenge their quarantine orders in court. To this day, Liberian Americans in Connecticut experience shame and stigma as a result of wrongly being labeled a threat to public health. This happened when HIV first, in the late 70s and early 80s. And they just quarantined. They didn't know anything about it. It was like, it happened to a friend of mine's brother. And the hospital just, oh God, and he was looked at like some crazy leper and don't let him cough or shake his hand. And it was like all this crazy fear and misinformation. That's why we can't have this on a legal level. So, by contrast, other states use far less restrictive measures like daily phone calls with health workers. That proved to be just as effective. Rather than immediately shooting for quarantines, the CDC could amend their rule to use such options where possible, which I think is smart. Like, I think quarantine needs to be sort of the last result. And if someone is quarantined again, they should have the right to food. I mean, like, if you're going to say I'm quarantining you, then I need to be able to feed you if I'm going to lock you up, in essence. And this is the problem. You see, how the CDC will react to these criticisms is unclear. They left the rule online for a 2-month period of public comment that ended on October 14th. Important people in this field did not know about this until the comment period had closed, Nuzzo says. If the CDC and wanted to put these regulations through and make them as good as possible, it wouldn't publish an 88-page document and hope whoever needs to know sees it in 2 months. Still, the agency received over 15,000 comments. The vast majority of these were crank-like and incoherent. Really? People posted winged bird things on the internet? Oh, I'm sure the comments below this video are saying. About 500 to 600 of those 15,000, almost 16,000 comments were meaningful and came from health agencies like Doctors Without Borders, legal scholars, the airline industry, and more. The CDC has to respond to these and then issue a final rule, which must be approved by senior members of the Department of Health and Human Services and potentially by the president. Uh-oh. In a statement, Kathy Harbin from the CDC's Division of Public Affairs said, during this active rulemaking period, we are unable to discuss the proposed rule or disclose how CDC will respond to the public comments. CDC will carefully review and consider each comment before publication of its final rule. The problem here, and Hodge says this, is like they give out some inside information and then they're just trying to push it through. Like they're not doing the full process. Like it's fine to propose this, but then everyone needs to, like, not the wingbirds, but people like Doctors Without Borders and these scientists and lawyers that are in this article and people like this need to be able to weigh in and bring up things that maybe you didn't think of. The fact that they're trying to push this through is not very comforting. Since Trump, and I talked about this in the other video, his responses to outbreaks in the past, right? During the Ebola outbreak, he promoted false information of the disease, repeatedly called for the U.S. to stop all flights from Ebola-infected countries, and said that American health workers who became infected should be stopped from re-entering the country and must suffer the consequences. So I'm afraid Trump would grossly misuse this vague law. So the CDC has come out against travel bans at the time, but their new regulation, though well-intentioned, might pave the way for similarly draconian measures. Its regulations inadvertently create a space for decisions that are not evidence-based and might violate constitutional liberties and principles of health ethics, says Felon. It's a space where ideology can play out. Again, guys, we got to pay attention and weigh in on this and talk to your local lawmakers do some research about this CDC rule, because you wouldn't want this to happen to you. You know, you wouldn't want to I travel a lot for a living. I wouldn't want to just come back and be quarantined or be stuck in some country and I'm not sick and no one's giving me anything. Or if I was sick and I wasn't getting treatment, I was just locked up in some tent, I wouldn't want that. So that's another thing we all need to pay attention to, especially since Trump has taken over soon. Wake up. This has been Graham Elwood for the Church of Batman.